the last Climate Action Committee meeting for this triennium. It is Thursday, the 8th of September 2022. I want to acknowledge everyone here and anyone that's joined us online. Just see. There we go. And yeah, and I just want to thank everybody for getting to this point. It's a complex, challenging and heavy topic. I think we've given it a really good go over the last 3 years to upskill ourselves, and that's all right. Great. And yeah, I'm really proud of where we've come so far, but let's get into it. We have apologies. I haven't received any apologies, and Kataraina has let me know she's not here, but she's ex officio anyway. And I see we have all the members present other than Stu Husband, and I heard from Tippa she will be online, but I haven't seen her on there yet. So perhaps we'll just put her down for lateness. Yeah. Thank you. I'll move that. Do I have a seconder? Dennis Tegg. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you. Then we'll confirm the agenda. So we have got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items today. Yep. And we'll just take you through those. Does anybody have anything to say in regards to the agenda? Cool. Thanks, Angela, for moving. Fred will second. All those in favour, please say aye. Okay. Against? Carried. Great. I was going to play a little video for you all from the Rangatahi Climate Change Bootcamp that Regional Council and Borough Schools have been putting on over yesterday and today. Fred and I attended their dinner last night, and it was really cool to hear from them all. We've just got some technical issues on sound and video. If I figure out a way to play it for you at the end of the meeting, I will. Otherwise, I'll make a link available for everyone here to have a look at it. It was a really, really good time hearing from them all. All right, so the disclosures of interest in regards to our agenda, anyone? In that case, we can... Yes, Andrew?
I'm no longer, I have resigned as the chair of FarmX, which is a software tool used for modelling economic scenarios on farms.
Great, then we'll update the register through William. Thank you. FarmX, chair of FarmX, no longer. Okay. Great, then I'll move those. Andrew, do you want a second? Okay, all those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Great, so we've gotten that admin out of the way. Karen, you're here with me. Do you have anything you'd like to say start of the meeting to set us up?
Thank you, Chair. Atamarie members and Atamarie colleagues, staff. Thanks, everyone. Here we are at our last meeting, and I just want to thank you all for your support. We've come a long way from a standing start in February 2020, and last meeting in June, we reported all the actions we have completed through the Climate Action Roadmap implementation, and many of the staff sitting along the side there have been involved in that. This meeting is about the work we are now doing to set us up for the next 3 years, next 10 years, and indeed the next 100 years. The National Adaptation Plan, released in August, the National Emissions Reduction Plan, released in May, together map out New Zealand's overall response to climate change. And councils must have regard to these plans. And this is the work we are doing now, and that is to integrate and translate all our roadmap pathways into those 2 plans and identify any gaps that we might need to plug as we go forward. So the papers we present today are about the what's ahead and covering both adaptation and mitigation. And we might, as we finish up, just reflect on a meeting we had with Rod Carr, the Climate Commission chair, about 2 weeks ago, and his views on Council's role in adaptation, very clear, and also in mitigation. And it might be useful for us to have a conversation, and indeed one of the papers being presented by Mike Scarsbrook does give us the opportunity to talk about regional approach to mitigation vis-a-vis national. So with that,
Great.
we'll move on to our first item. Through you, Chair.
Yep, sure. No, I'm particularly excited to finally have national direction on both mitigation and adaptation. It really allows us to move forward as a council with all the great ideas and enthusiasm that we have, while not needing to be concerned as much as to the uncertainty of what's coming, in that sense of, will we be in alignment if we do this or not? Because we can now see that we're either going to be aligning with the National Emission Reduction Plan or the National Adaptation Plan or not, and so can adjust course as we go. So yes, the first item is being presented by Lisa Armstrong, if you want to come up. And I see online we also have James Hughes, the Climate and Resilience Specialist from Tonkin and Taylor, who had the pleasure of meeting last year, at a couple of years ago actually, at the Climate Change and Business Conference in Auckland. So welcome, James. Great, I'll get you to turn on the mic, and welcome Rick, please. Yes, look forward to having you part of this as well. So an update on the local climate change risk assessment to inform our response to the National Adaptation Plan. Off you go.
Wonderful, thank you. Oh, William, would you mind sharing the presentation?
Great.
Next slide, thanks. Kia ora koutou. Thank you for this opportunity to update you on our work on the climate change risk assessment. So the purpose of our report today is to update you on the work that we've been progressing over the last few months since we last met and updated you, and also to seek approval of our summary report, which is attached as Appendix 1 to send to stakeholders. We've divided our presentation today into three parts. So an overview of phase 1, which I'll cover, risk identification workbook, which James Hughes, who is online, will cover, and phase 2 planning and next steps, which Rick and I together will cover. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to acknowledge James here today. You'll recall from our report, James Hughes from Tonkin and Taylor, you'll recall from our report in March that we engaged Tonkin and Taylor to assist us with our climate change risk assessment, and we're fortunate to have James helping us directly in this work, as he was indeed one of the lead authors for the guidance that the Ministry for the Environment produced on local climate change risk assessments. So he's been closely involved in our work. So thank you, James, and you'll hear from him shortly. So, and of course, we've also got Rick here because regional resilience is also a key part of the project team. The next slide, thanks, William. So I thought I'd just quickly recap some of our project objectives. We've covered these in much more detail in the past and earlier reports, but one of the key reasons that we're doing this is to understand the priority risks to inform adaptation, planning and targeted action for our region, and then to be able to communicate and share those key risks to our stakeholders and partners in the region. And so it's important, I think, to recognise that we also need to be really cognizant of the operating and legislative environment that we're working in. So we have, the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which was released in 2020, the National Adaptation Plan, which was informed by that risk assessment, was released this year, and then also, we're all well aware of the coming resource management reforms, where regional spatial planning will be a really key aspect, and also the Climate Adaptation Act. So this risk assessment is a key foundation piece of work, building into that current direction and legislative environment. So one of the things to also note that with the risk assessment is, although we've looked at, we have a huge body of information in our region and within our organisation, but this is actually bringing together, this piece of work is actually bringing together a lot of that information into one place. And so it's a comprehensive risk assessment, so it takes a broad view of climate risk, and one of the aims is to extend the knowledge, our Waikato climate risk knowledge, across all of the sort of broadly the 5 domains used in the National Climate Change risk assessment, so the natural and built environment, human, economy and governance. And then one of the other key aims from this project is to actually try and understand more and check that we know what we don't know. And so that we can identify information gaps and further projects and how we can then work through across the region to fill those information gaps. So next slide, thanks. So we've been carrying out our risk assessment in accordance with the approach set out in the guidance provided by the Ministry for the Environment. And as part of that, we've designed our work in 2 phases. So the first phase, which I'm very happy to report we've now completed, was phase 1 to complete risk identification and screening. And so the aim of that piece of work is to pull together a long list of risks that are key to the Waikato region, and to inform that long list of risks, draw on the knowledge and expertise of both our internal subject matter experts and also our regional stakeholders across the region and our iwi Māori partners. So as I said, 2 phases. So we'll talk about phase 1 in a bit more detail in this part, and then at the end we'll talk about our work to plan and scope phase 2, which is the detailed assessment. So the deliverable from phase 1 is essentially risk identification workbook, and it's essentially we now have this very large, significant and comprehensive collection of risks for the region, and which is really useful to have these all brought together. And now we, as I said, in phase 2, working through how we're going to, understand those in more detail. I'd also, just while we're at this, talking about concluding phase 1, like to acknowledge the work of the project team that was involved in this. So Rick is sitting here beside me from Regional Resilience. There was also Whitney Mills from Regional Resilience as well, who did a huge amount of work in terms of, she's sitting here as well, who did a huge amount of work carrying out the desktop review to help inform the risk assessment, so the desktop review of existing information. Tutahanga Douglas from Tairanga Whenua, Melissa Hackle from Science and Social, she's online as well, from Social and Economic Science, Inga from Communications, and more recently, as we've been moving into phase 2, we've also been joined by Derek Finn from GIS and Spatial Planning, Stephen Hunt from Science, and of course Blair Dickey, our climate guru, has always been close at hand and is now also formally part of our project team for phase 2 moving forward. So I would like to really, acknowledge the contributions of those staff.
And the councillors.
And I've got that later, Karen, in my bit. Yeah. So, and you also.
Karen.
Project team, thank you.
Yes. So, and as part of that, you'll recall back in March, the committee resolved to form a subgroup of councillors to provide governance oversight. So I would like to thank those councillors, so Councillor Nicol, Tegg, Kneebone and McPherson, for your interest and your oversight and guidance in this work as we've progressed it. So, now, from here, I think I'll hand over.
Everyone had a chance to go
all
onto
the
it.
councillors, but the particular subgroup that provided oversight.
Carry on,
so,
Lisa.
Now, at this point, I will hand over to James Hughes from Tonkin and Taylor, who is waiting online for us, and he will take you through the process that we used to develop the risk identification workbook and some of the information and how we gathered that. So he's our technical expert. So.
Thanks, Lisa. Kia ora tātou. Can everyone hear me okay?
At the end.
You can hear me? Great. If you could go to the next slide, that'd be great. And kia ora everyone, good morning. My name's James Hughes. I'm dialing in from Tauranga. I'm based over here, and as Lisa was saying, I've been fortunate enough to be have worked on a range of sort of climate risk and resilience related projects over the last sort of 10 years or so, and my background is in initially in engineering, but I've been advising government and councils in New Zealand for the last while around these types of projects, and was fortunate enough to work on the national risk assessment and a range of regional level and increasingly district level assessments as well for councils. So I'll just give you a quick overview of, I guess, what we did and what the process was, and then just a flavour of some of the findings that have come out from this first phase, and happy to take questions as we go through. So we, as you can see on screen, this phase has involved initially a review, a comprehensive review of existing information, predominantly held by the regional council, which was extensive, and there has been a lot of really good work that's has been undertaken around the climate and natural hazard context, as well as various studies historically around vulnerabilities of various risk elements or areas of risk within the region. We then put out a survey, and we generally do surveys for these types of projects, and we had by far the greatest response that we've sort of seen from our end at Tonkin and Taylor anyway from the survey respondents. So we had over 90 responses to that survey, and they were really detailed, and a lot of you I know who are on this call responded in detail. So we had a very rich breadth of information that was gathered through that survey, and that effectively asked people at a high level what was their key concerns around climate change, and then had some detailed sections where people could identify specific elements at risk related to specific climate hazards, and they were able to put as many of those in as they felt were relevant, and we captured and synthesized that information. We then moved into the workshop phase, where we held 3 workshops. One was a subject matter expert workshop with the regional council's staff on the 30th of May, and these workshops were generally sort of 3 or 4 hours in duration, and we then held an external stakeholder workshop on the 9th of June, and then a specific iwi focused workshop as well, a hui that we held. And just to sort of build on that a little bit, this is a similar process that we've also noted and noticed and been part of in other regions, and having those targeted conversations with those different groups, and particularly iwi has been beneficial and important in gathering the breadth of views on climate risks in relation to different stakeholder values in regions. So those workshops went really well, and the purpose of those was to validate and add to the information that was received from the survey. And as you can imagine, we had a huge array of information that we then went about consolidating into the summary workbook that Lisa has mentioned. So if you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So at a high level summary, we have identified 231 direct risks across 44 elements. And I'll explain a little bit more what that means. So direct risks, and you'll see underneath there are 55 indirect risks. So the distinction between direct and indirect is important in the sense that it differentiates between a direct risk is where you might have, say, the effect of extreme temperature impacting on livestock in a farming situation, or the impact of flooding directly impacting on property or infrastructure. So there's a direct relationship between a climate hazard and something that gets impacted or damaged. An indirect risk are sort of second order or third order implications that might be economic implications, or as you can see down the bottom, social cohesion, community well-being, psychosocial impacts of communities getting flooded or disrupted in their daily activities, impacts on employment, or we've written there as well, impacts on the ability to deliver services, whether they be business as usual services that council deliver or emergency response services as well. So we've got this distinction between the direct and the indirect risks. And yeah, as you can see, and the elements are those is the piece of language we've used to denote the thing that is at risk. So whether that be, and as you can see there in the direct context, terrestrial ecosystems or species, horticulture or agriculture, land, buildings, and there's 44 of them in different categories, and I'll give you a sense of some of those in a second. So that's the overview. If you can go to the next slide and give you a bit more detail. And please don't try and read this, but this gives you a sense of what the workbook is, how it's laid out, and those little buttons on the left there you can click on if anyone was interested in seeing it, and you can select if you're interested in what risks apply to different hazards. Those are in the top left. So you've got changes in variability and seasonality of rainfall, you've got decreased frost, dryness and drought. So you can click on any of those and see what risks pertain to that hazard. Or you can click on the right and you can see the long list in blue there of the risk elements, and there's 44 of those. So if you were interested in active modes of transport, you could click on the risks to that, or agriculture and livestock, airports, aquaculture and fisheries, biodiversity, etc., etc. So you can see it's been a very broad process. We've covered the built environment, the economy, the human and sort of health-related impacts to natural environments and ecosystems, as well as broader, touched on broader risks to governance, organisational risks or reputational type risks as well. So there's a wide range. The only other thing I'll mention on this slide is you could sort of see how the actual content is laid out. So if you wanted to filter, you can then see quite a decent amount of detail in there, which is written up in a way that people can go and search for what they want to look for. So
James, could I just, forgive me for interrupting, I was just going to say, could I just add that, I mean, this is only a snapshot of some of the columns in the risk workbook. So there is, for example, columns relating to geographical examples, so where we've been able to gather from our sources of information that feed into this risk workbook, where there are particular geographic examples, those are also noted. And of course, as we move into the further future phases, the mapping of those will become really key.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks,
Lisa.
As you were, James.
That's
No,
right.
It's a good addition. Thank you. Okay, so if you can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So this is, again, I'll just walk you through these quickly, but it might sort of lead to some questions at the end. So these are the types of hazards that were addressed. So if we go through those, you've got changes in variability and seasonality of rainfall. Climate change in general was captured, and that is more related to the indirect risks that can stem from various elements of climate change, but the more specific ones: decreased frost, dryness and drought is an issue. Extreme weather events is something that we're obviously seeing a lot more of: wind storms, extreme rainfall, ex-tropical cyclones, that type of weather. Groundwater rise and salinity stress, it's not well understood in many parts of New Zealand, but it's something that's increasingly being, investigated, and there are various areas of concern around New Zealand, and something that I think most people would argue there needs to be more work around understanding groundwater rise, both particularly in coastal environments where groundwater is connected to the sea level, if you like. There's a subsurface connection, so when the sea rises, the groundwater will rise as well. Higher temperatures and increasing hot days, coastal erosion, fire weather is a really interesting one that I think, in a New Zealand context, again, we're less prepared for than many other countries, and something that, if we do experience in the next 50 years, extreme temperatures and the likes of the UK have been experiencing, which is plausible, 35-degree days, 40-degree, those extreme temperatures, it can cause obviously significant impacts. Moving down, sort of volatility of weather, hail frequency, flooding, both fluvial and pluvial, so that means river-based flooding or more sort of rainfall-induced in urban environments, fluvial flooding. Landslides and soil erosion, which we're well aware of. The marine heat waves and ocean chemistry one was very interesting for the Waikato region, particularly in the Firth of Thames. So that's something worth looking into, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And obviously sea level and coastal flooding, and generally warmer and wetter winters. And this is the selection of direct, I suppose, climate variable and climate-induced hazards, and there are probably a range of other sort of second order hazards that aren't listed there, and the one that probably comes to mind is pests and diseases, which sort of isn't a direct climate hazard, but as a result of climate change, where we're potentially going to get more pests and pathogens in the country from different sources, and that can have implications for particularly the agricultural sector and many others as well. So that's our climate hazard list, and that was used to identify risks. And if you move on again, I've got a more to the next slide. Again, this is our list, and I won't go through this, but this is our direct and indirect risk elements. So you can see there's hopefully most things you'd be interested in are in one of those lists there. You'll note that the ones on the left are sort of direct elements, whether they be airports or native species, landfills, transport, tourism, etc. And one on the right are generally more second order implications, so impacts on council services, funding, cost of living, insurance retreat, supply chains, etc. So that's our risk element list. And now I'll just go through a couple of examples, really, just to give you a feel for some of the detail and some of the implications. And as you can imagine, out of 200 and something risks, we had to choose a few that were might be of interest. So if you go to the next slide, I can just talk you through some examples. So this first one is the risk to transmission and distribution line infrastructure for electricity due to increased fire weather. So that was a risk that came out, quite clearly from stakeholders we spoke to. And if you look at the detail that's written, there's kind of two parts to this risk. The electricity network itself being at risk of damage or loss of assets due to wildfire where they're close to vegetation. But the second part of this risk is that network is kind of a double-edged sword. It can also act as a catalyst to cause fires when there's arcing or sagging within the lines, and in extreme temperatures the lines themselves can sag quite a lot. And I was actually coincidentally reading something on this from a journal the other day, and we need to, when we get more extreme temperatures, the sagging of those lines actually means when they blow in the wind, they can kind of go out quite a far distance from the corridors that some of those infrastructure corridors that they're within, and it means the management of vegetation needs a bit more attention, especially in high wind zones. So that's a risk, and there's a bit more detail there. The second part of this, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Councillor Teague was quite involved in providing a lot of really useful information and context for this, and I know a lot of other councillors did, but I might be wrong here. I think some of this came directly from him. Just also talking about the indirect implications for wildfire that occurs outside of the Waikato region, but we've got our high voltage transmission system that connects the South Island to the North Island, and I guess the implication of an outage more broadly in the electricity network due to fire that might have implications for Waikato. So the interconnectedness of our networks, and particularly the power network, means there's risks outside of the region as well that we need to be considered. And the second part of that, you can see there's gaps that were identified in terms of understanding in a bit more detail where those risks might play out in terms of networks mapped against vegetation or wildfire projections, and that's an emerging sort of science at the moment. And also, I guess, understanding criticalities and bottlenecks within the broader system, or where there's potential implications on that second order impact if we have an outage further outside the region, and where those concerns might be. So yeah, that's just an example of that particular risk. So you can see there's quite a useful amount of detail of explaining why it's a risk, and we've identified also some gaps in information. So that's one. This next one is a different context. This is the risk to marine ecosystems. So it's a natural environment one, and marine ecosystems, estuaries and species due to marine heat waves and ocean chemistry changes. So a very complex area, this, and we drew largely on the knowledge of your teams internally, and who obviously are very well aware of this. So you can see there's quite a bit of information in there. It talked about, in summary, those intertidal habitats in shallow environments, particularly Firth of Thames, but also in other areas. And with the marine temperatures rising, there's potential for a die-off, heat stress, and also the interface between, I suppose, land-based nutrients and contaminants entering those waterways, potential for algal blooms, increased exotic species, and general disruption of the food web. So you can see there's the natural environment risks in general are complex because ecosystems are inherently complex. So we've tried to capture through speaking with yourselves some of those interrelationships, and these are generally areas that are lesser well understood, both in terms of the impacts, but also the tolerances of some species and ecosystems. So definitely an area for further research in some of those some parts. And if you look at some of the more detail there in the second paragraph, we've documented in recent years that there's been mass die-offs of shellfish in response to thermal stress, increased botulism outbreaks in the Firth of Thames, impacts on birds, killing birds, and likely that those could increase in severity and frequency, impacts on vegetation, the fact that the temperature of the oceans and the heat waves are major stressors in systems that are already under stress for other reasons. And so you've got a cumulative or an exacerbating nature that, as you're well aware, we've got, as I mentioned, the land-based nutrient loads that might enter some waterways, but also impacts from the sea. And so these things can be additive. Moving on, then we've got, I think the last one there might be one more after this. So this was more of a risk to, one that came from the hui and risk to tikanga due to climate change. And there was a range of commentary captured here. So the first part was that traditional indicators or tohu that are used to understand and forecast changes in the environment could become disrupted and less reliable. And those, an example that's often given is the signals that come from Pōhutukawa that bloom in certain times and signal when certain activities should or could be undertaken. So they become less reliable and impact on decision making that iwi and hapu might undertake. Loss of species, taonga species, coastal flooding directly impacting on iwi, causing them to need to move away from their traditional places. And loss of sort of whakapapa and stories and passing on for younger generations. And there's a range of other implications that are listed below. And this is another complex area that we captured at a high level, and then in phase 2, there might be benefit and desire to go into more detail. You can see some of the other ones listed there at the bottom. And then moving on to the last one is another indirect risk, which is really around the social cohesion impacts that are likely. And this is, again, a broad risk that could be driven from a range of direct risks, and whether they might be increased frequencies of extreme flooding that we've seen around Nelson and other parts of New Zealand. So if we get more extreme events and more disruption, that can lead to obviously a range of health and well-being and economic issues, etc., and the social cohesion impacts that might and well-being impacts that might result from that. Displacement of communities. The other part I'll just add on this one is, I suppose, in the other direction, and that we're sort of, if you think about what level temperatures might get to in some of our neighbouring countries, particularly Australia, there's potential for a significant immigration from Australia and the Pacific into New Zealand over the next 50, 100 years. New Zealand will be affected by climate, but not as badly in terms of temperature as Australia will. So I imagine will be a desirable place for people to move to, and that'll place a lot of pressure on communities and to cope with more immigration potentially, and different communities and ethnicities that might come into New Zealand. So that's an impact as well that's captured within this type of social cohesion discussion. Yeah, so that's a very brief overview of some of the information that we captured. Lisa, do you want me to pass back to you to cover this one?
Yeah, please. Thanks, James.
Yeah.
Right, so our next phase of this work is to carry out our detailed risk assessment, and the report outlines how we'll carry out that. So really that's bringing together focus groups of subject matter experts to really focus on a group of risks, and there'll be multiple focus groups focusing on their areas of expertise to prioritise and rate those risks. And there's a methodology set out as to how to do that in the guidance from the Ministry for the Environment. Of course, there's multiple ways to skin a cat, even with the methodology. So we're actually going to conduct an initial pilot of a smaller group of risks to test how we want to carry it out here for the Waikato region. So as I mentioned earlier, we want to be identifying critical information gaps from this work and then being able in a position to communicate regional risk information out to our stakeholders.
Great. Next
Yes,
slide.
we will also, and it's in the report, have a specific work stream for iwi Māori climate risk, so we can really focus on the needs of iwi Māori in our region. And as I mentioned, we're currently scoping at the moment and working through some of the questions that are outlined in the report about how we actually carry out that approach, and also what pilot topic we start with. So
Great.
I'll wrap it up there. The final slide is in the report, so it outlines the time frame.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Lisa and James. Really appreciate it. We're a little bit over time, but it was really interesting information, especially with James when you painted those pictures of really making those risks real. Our first speaker to ask a question or make a comment is Councillor Litchfield.
Yeah, thank you. You did actually cover it, so I'm pleased you said wait. In evaluating the highest risk, what, and actually, red, orange, down to the least risk. So you can look at potentially what those highest risks to humanity is. And you touched on the power grid. If that was to go out in a heat wave, in a bushfire, that might be the top one. It'd be helpful just to look at a prioritised list of the most severe to the least severe, maybe acid C being least, something like that, that would try and put it in some sort of order that we could look at and think, well, wow, we really do need to emphasise doing something about that particular highest risk. And just
Totally
just,
hearing you.
just a
Yes.
thought.
Through you, Madam Chair, Councillor Litchfield, that's actually the in focus of phase 2. So actually rating the risks so we can understand the severity of them, and then accordingly, working out how we respond. So that should inform our response.
Awesome. Yes.
Sorry.
Did you have a?
Just following through.
Because
things are changing.
no, you've got the mic now. Go for
because
it.
things are changing, rapidly. There's new things evolving. How easy will that be to add to this or to modify, in ring? Example, I know that there is a major biological risk now to our native forests. Kaikatea have been identified as having the same disease or similar disease to carry dieback. And now been informed that 90% of the New Zealand forest is susceptible to a disease that's emerging that could completely wipe it out. Yet I'm not sure whether any of these things have been identified as yet, because it's new emerging science.
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that the risk workbook will never actually be a final complete document. It'll really be an iterative process that as new information becomes available, we continually update our body of information and rating of those risks. And as you know, the National Climate Change Risk Assessment is repeated every 6 years. So we will also be, continually revising our risk information and understanding of regional risk to feed into that process.
And we can set that review time for ours, in the next council. Councillor Quayle.
Thank you. There's a matter which I don't think has got enough emphasis in this whole thing. I heard you mentioned the words comms related, just in a passing phrase. I want to talk about an indirect matter which is all about communication and disinformation. Now, we've got an overwhelming amount of material coming out with all sorts of impacts. And what that does is it will activate the disinformation community, it will activate conspiracy, it will activate, we've already seen that in some of our work when we were trying to describe something over on the coastal plan and what happened over there in terms of Coromandel. That's just a snapshot of a little thing. So here we have a very big piece of work which has impacts to every person that lives here and around the world. So it's ripe for communication issues, yet it doesn't score any very highly anywhere. So I want to sort of give that a lot of airtime. It should be up there as a very significant indirect impact. And what also feeds off that is another thing which, again, I don't see as an indirect impact, which is the psychological effect on the populace. The effect of all this, if you look at all the things that you read now, it will just be overwhelming in terms of, how am I going to deal with this? So that should be it does make a reference to social cohesion, I'll give you that, but it doesn't really give it moment. That this is probably the most significant. The only other one that gets anywhere near it is war. But this is greater than that in every respect, because war tends to be isolated to an area or a part, whereas this is all encompassing. So I would like to see us maybe have a real leadership approach in this regional council of highlighting issues around the psychological and around that that communication and misinformation area. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry. Is there any response from you, Lisa, or are you good with that? That's right.
I could perhaps just acknowledge that within the risk workbook, I mean, there's 231 direct risks, and I can't recall them now off the top of my head, the number of indirect risks, but I know that amongst those, there's quite a number that relate to the psychological effects and impacts on our population in relation to climate change impacts.
And I totally agree with you, Councillor Quayle. Classic reasons for why the work should have started a long time ago when we knew some of the science. Stu Kneebone.
Thanks. Just curious on the process to decide between what's a direct and what's an indirect, and I'm referring to the impact of climate change on biodiversity and our native species. And if I recall correctly, I think that was classified as an indirect risk.
I can't, I'd have to go back and look at the slide, but could I perhaps take the opportunity to hand over to our risk and expert that's waiting online to answer questions such as these? He can probably do much better justice to it than myself.
James, did you have something for that?
Yeah, so the biodiversity ones are generally direct risks. They are, yeah. So they were, yeah, generally direct risks. I'm just looking, I've got it open on my other screen. There are some biosecurity ones that are currently in the indirect. And look, in many cases, there's probably, most of them are easy to distinguish. Some of them are a little bit nuanced. How they're categorized, I think, is less important in the sense of we need to manage them and whether they sit within the direct or indirect part. But generally, I think they're relatively consistent in how they've been categorised. Yeah, and the biodiversity ones. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. I was just sort of thinking on the concept that obviously any impact on biodiversity or native species generally is quite a long. The process to realise that impact is often quite long, but nonetheless, it's still quite significant. But no,
absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Dennis.
Oh, thanks. One of the things that occurs to me is, and it's further to Fred's point in terms of assessment of risk, so that we emphasise where there is extreme short-term risk. Because often people look at sea level rise or something like that and think, oh, that's not going to happen decades or even the end of the century. Just to take the example of, the new data from NZ sea rise and vertical land movement, that in itself can bring forward the risk from what we thought it might have been by maybe decades. So I think that's an important element in terms of communicating the risk. You know, what is not only extreme but also short term. So that's one point I'd make. And I was pleased to hear you say how this workbook's going to be, you know, updated on a regular basis, because I imagine even since you've begun it, we've now got new sea level rise projections come out from MFE, and I think next year we'll have the full guidance come out. And you know, that's using the latest IPCC information, but also the NZC rise stuff, which is saying, you know, we need to have more regard to vertical land movement in these assessments, etc. So there's just a couple of points I'd make. There was reference to the lack of information about groundwater, and I see got Mike here. I'm aware that he's involved in the study in Thames. I just wondered if there's an opportunity to give us a wee bit of an update on that, if that's out of scope or. But...
It would be great to get an update on that in offline, just because of the time we've got. Yeah.
All right.
We're quite a bit behind
All
already.
right. Well, I'll leave it there then. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. In that case, move on to Angela.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you, Lisa and the team for the work that you've done so far. Just looking at some of the risks in there, lack of frost. We know that the ski season has been quite severe for the bottom half of our region. Just wondering how we communicate those sorts of risks, you know, for whole communities down that way, that their whole, you know, economic well-being is quite, you know, it's resting on one form of tourism, I'd say. How do we long-term sort of communicate that risk that might be going? Is that not really our job?
I think as part of this work, we're actually going to be working out the best way that we can communicate this information. I mean, for those of you, the councillors that have seen the risk identification workbook, there's an overwhelming amount of information in this. We actually need to draw out the key points, but that really needs to happen after this next phase, where we've actually rated the risks and gone through a process of, and the next phase looks at different timescales and different scenarios in terms of climate projections. So we will have a far greater understanding of what the priority risks are for our region across different time horizons. And I think that's the point at which we then, you know, focus on how we best communicate that.
Okay, no, thank you.
And Rick, would you like to?
Yeah, so if I just wanted to add to that as well, is one thing we need to be quite clear about is this risk assessment work isn't the only work stream that's going on out there, but it can inform these other work streams. And so as an example, if we look at the community adaptation planning work that we've been working with on the Wharakawa coast and with TCDC on the shoreline management planning work, there are going to be others as well. And you know, I think at the Hauraki Plains is next, we're looking at parts of the Waikato district as well. So that's a more in-depth community engagement plan that we'll be working with our TA partners on. So the information that the risk assessment has identified will be able to be pulled in to that more focused community engagement process as well. And that's probably a better way to as a vehicle to bring out this risk assessment work.
And actually, just one further observation is just remember with this risk identification workbook, there is an extremely broad range of risks in there. And so we as a council will not actually necessarily be the owner of any of all of those risks. That, you know, they will potentially fall central government, different sectors in our region. I mean, and then there will be that, I guess there will come a point where council needs to decide, you know, where is our advocacy role and leadership role in terms of sharing information in relation to these risks. You know, what is our core business as usual that we need to really focus on addressing, you know, in terms of our functions. So.
Thank you. If I may, just one
quick one.
Different tact. It talks on page 9 about the objectives being to extend climate risk knowledge, and then it talks about governance. Just wondering about on your agenda, page 9, Just wondering, next triennium, new mayors, new councillors, etc. Just wondering about the role of the mayoral forum in extending that knowledge.
Totally agree.
Barry talked about misinformation. Wondering if there was a, Jen, you've been really helpful to me to upskill me in my knowledge with, books and podcasts. I was talking to someone recently and they said for a lot of their things, for their council comms, they're doing lots of really innovative things, and they're even doing like short 15-minute podcasts to communicate to members of the public. So it's easy and it's accessible. Just would really like to see us moving in that direction as well, not only for elected members, but for the general public as well. So, yeah, and just finally, Lisa, I might come and see you and delve a bit deeper into some of those work specifically. But cool, thank you.
Thanks for that contribution, Angela. Fred, I'm just going to, if I could ask you to turn yours off, I'm keen to have Andrew go first, because you hadn't spoken yet, Andrew, are you sure? Because we can come back to Fred quickly at the end. It's just that, okay.
Oh, look, I want to point out what Councillor Quayle has said, in that this is doom and gloom, and it is as bad as war, if not worse than war. And I think a lot of, the school kids, our youth,
spoke to yesterday. Yeah.
They are more onto it, but there's a lot of youth out there that are distracted by, are brought to distraction, and that are doing crime, that aren't attending school, because they've got this doom and gloom. End of the world is coming, and let's just have a big party and who cares? I think part of this is that we've got to identify or include solutions. We've got to have some positive aspect to this, and what communities can do, individuals can do, along with this doom gloom report. I think it's really important.
It speaks really nicely to what Councillor Strange was just talking about in regards to making information accessible to the public, and that should be around all the cool things that are happening that we are actually doing, because I feel like that is something that is often missing still. People are then busy doing the doing and not talking about the doing that they're doing. But thank you for that, because I do agree. Andrew.
This is a great paper. Well done. And James, thank you for the care you put into your slides. I'm increasingly of the view that the voters are not going to care about how much we know about climate change until they know how much we care about it. And putting comms articles in papers ain't going to demonstrate caring. We have to find a way to occupy the hearts and minds of the people of the Waikato. If you think about what Chair Barry said and what Councillor Litchmark said, sensational contributions, because what they're saying is these risks aren't all created equal, and we need to start getting a sense of how they're prioritised and how we're going to tell the story. So we need a marketing team. We do not need a comms team. We need a marketing team and a comms team to work together. Because if you think about it, within the last few days, what did we hear about well-being? We heard a bunch of indicators that we should not be that proud of. So we need to be able to tell these stories and not just fire a bunch of noise at the electorate. So I'm absolutely in Fred's camp, and James, I think in terms of your risks and indirect risks on slide 6, for example, you had them alphabetically ranked. I think it's time for us to start talking about the ones that we see as occupying our minds. I'm interested in what reaction you got from the farming community in phase 1, because, and I'm sorry, Chair, to bang on about it, but this has got stranded capital. And I'm glad we've got an economist in the room, or a man with interest in economics in the room, because this has got stranded capital written all over it. And so, yes, I can see social cohesion as a real issue when the 30-year-old couple with a young family who just bought their first farm and are donkey deep in debt get told, I'm sorry, you can't farm the peat anymore because it's a climate change risk. So I'm really interested in the nuance around the conversations that you've had with the people who've got capital at risk. I heard you talking at a national level about the government's got capital at risk because of the high voltage direct current lines. And while I applaud that, I think we need to get down in the weeds now and start thinking about the people that are actually going to have to write capital off their balance sheet. The other thing that's going on in my mind, in another life, I chair a genetics company, and it's really clear to me that the genomes as we understand them are really going to be in trouble. And for example, I don't think we're going to be able to farm sheep in the top of the North Island because of climate change. And if you think about that, we are going to need gene sequences available to plants and to animals to be able to maybe store more carbon, maybe have a better immune response if you're a kahikatea tree. Certainly if you're an animal, the ability to mount an immune response to fight off diseases that are going to come at us is going to be really important. And so my question is of the scientist in the room, and to James really, it sounds, James, like you have the ear of the government, and I suspect, Mike, you too have the ear of political leaders. So at what point will we say it's our considered opinion that we're no longer happy to be the last of the flat earth society, and we actually want to empower our economy with some technologies that'll actually enable us to fight this thing called climate change? And whether we like it or not, call it what you like. I call it genetic engineering, and it's a taboo subject. So I'm wondering, at what point are we thinking about adaptation in terms of our animals and our plants and the breadth of tools that we can use?
Is
So
that your
those are my
question?
comments, really.
Yeah, thank you.
And questions.
Did you have something for that, James?
Thanks for the commentary and the very well made points. And I think, you know, you've touched on a whole range of topics there. The stranded assets one is a big deal, and that is not only in terms of, you know, you gave the example of the farming community in response to, I suppose, climatic changes that make it much more difficult for them to carry on their farming activities, whether that's directly or indirectly because water isn't as available as in the allocation of water. The other side of stranded assets is going to be the carbon challenge and the implications of, you know, carbon prices, etc., that are going to increase, no doubt, significantly, and they could get up to hundreds of dollars a ton of carbon very quickly. So you're exactly right. And the communication or marketing, if you like, response to that, I think, is key. A lot of councils we've worked with are doing these risk assessments. And just to sort of go back to some of the other questions, which are very well put, the risk assessments can generally look for most of the risks, they can be rated, and the rating process gives you a rating at different points in time. So responding to, I think it was Councillor Tegg was suggesting we need to be able to identify those risks that are more extreme or high earlier in time, and so see that the time response. So the risk assessment does enable that to prioritise those risks which are you know, occurring earlier. And the vertical land movement stuff does respond to that. But a lot of councils are doing these risk assessments, and then they're thinking about how they communicate that clearly to the public through specifically designed, you know, communications documents, if you like, that simplify the language. And it is very, this is the challenge, right? I mean, you could see we've got 300 or 200 and something individual risks that, where do you start with some of this? And so you do need to prioritise and shortlist, but again, the communication task needs to be well thought out. And to your last point, the government is acutely aware of these challenges, and they are across all sectors. The government will need to own some responses, and I think the one you've pointed to around technology and the role of technology and genetic technology, and that area will be probably a question, or will be a question for them. The response that councils and how councils respond to risk in hazardous areas, and that really difficult question of defending, accommodating or retreating homes from the coast or from floodplains. We currently don't have legislation that enables that to be done very, at all, and that's the purpose of the new Resource Management Act reforms. We'll have to wait and see how those unfold. So there's a lot going on, and some of this will land on it'll all land on your plate in some respects, and it's just how the government takes ownership of that and how your interfaces with them, and then how communities, I guess, get involved as well. I don't know if I've answered much of what you asked.
Thank you for that, James. And it actually, did you want Mike to comment as well? Yep, sure. Mike, are you happy to move forward to the mic? Yeah. Might be easiest to use Lisa's one. Just edit.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with Councillor McPherson. In terms of the risk to genetic diversity around climate change, it is going to be a significant driver of changes in the genomes, and particularly of both in terms of the distribution of species, but also the genetic variability in those species. In terms of genetic engineering, I think from a science perspective, I'd say that we would want all options to be open in terms of science investigation, but there's always other elements, and particularly political elements, about whether some options will be on the table or off the table. But from a science perspective, I would hope that all options can be explored. So thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. I'm going to take the chance to give a bit of feedback on the paper. I really appreciate it. And since the resolution that we're hoping to pass today is about approving the communication piece to go out to other stakeholders, I really like the look of that as well. My feedback would be, and it ties into a lot of what's been said, the next step forward and how we work with those stakeholders is really, really important. And what came to mind on this piece, just like it has on other bits of work on emission reduction, is how do we work together even more than we ever have before. So when I look at this, I'm just going to call it a top-down regional risk analysis, because it's quite high level and generic in some ways. When the territorial authorities are doing this, they will obviously be naming the maunga it applies to, or the river, or it'll get quite specific. And it got me thinking around, well, what is the best way to, in a quick period of time, get the quality out of it? Is it to enable the territorial authorities to do the detail well, and we just then happen to do a catch-all? Or is it for us to do this really well at the high level, which will then allow them to catch up quickly? So if you have any feedback on that, be welcome.
So, Madam Chair, that's actually one of the questions that we've been working through as we've been scoping phase 2. And one element of that is when we carry out this next phase, we will actually be able to, for particular risks, for some risks, a regional scale assessment and rating is fine, because probably the risk rating will be the same across the region. However, for some risks, for example, water supply, it needs to be at a district level, and within the body of our risk assessment, we'll be identifying which of those need a regional assessment and which ones can be addressed at a higher we'll be identifying which risks need a district scale assessment, and within our process, bringing in the territorial authorities to actually work with us to rate those risks or confirm the work that we've done.
That makes sense, because my experience is that the population will find it most easy to engage when it is their river or their road or their building, as opposed to us trying to communicate at some kind of high level. Andrew, did you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I did.
You look very excited.
Yeah, because Lisa, you said in your kōrero that I think you said we don't want to I'll put words in your mouth, we don't want to own that yet. And I think that's the right position to have. But sooner or later, Madam Chair, the TAs, we owe it to the TAs to have a regional perspective on this. We can't expect
Absolutely, a
the
leadership
people
position.
at Morco who vote for Waitoma District Council to take an active interest in what's happening
That's right.
at Akaka. So I think our role here absolutely is to help our TAs understand this message so that we can get in the hearts and minds of the voters. But Lisa, my question is, at what stage do you think in this process there's going to be, to Fred's point, half a dozen risks that we're absolutely going to own and we're going to keep talking about and keep talking about?
Well, because we're taking a staged approach, and as we complete each pilot for a particular focus group, a focused area of risk, hopefully from then, after the completion of each group of risks, we will have ratings in relation to that subset of risks. But then, of course, pulling that all together, we're aiming for the 30th of June next year. But we intend to release information as we are able to throughout the process.
Awesome, thank you. The other item I wanted to add was I'm always a fan of bringing forward the transition risk work wherever we can. So I've said that a few times, I thought I'd say it again. And it actually occurred to me that the National Adaptation Plan, the 10 principles and the 4 priorities there on page 25, they really seem to be very good. And I thought that would be an interesting starting point if you had a checklist of trying to assess how does it impact on those things to formulate. So I wanted to add that. In regards to, I've got here, unfortunately, I didn't reference which page it is on, so I'm just trying to find it. But you make some great points in paragraphs 27 and 28 on the kind of questions you're asking on page 13. If you did want direction, I thought the top 2 items in that table are the key focus areas, because the top one on critical infrastructure is really for the benefit of others, stakeholders, and the second one around our flood and drainage infrastructure is really for us. It's very difficult to prioritise between those 2, but I really do like prioritising those 2 above the bottom 2 and not overthinking it. And in regards to page 15, attachment 2, that table, I mentioned to Karen yesterday, what would really add value for me is if we added a column of the actual already observed climate impacts that we've seen in the region in various places, because when we only rely on the modelling, as amazing as it is, it tends to talk about the averages, so the average temperature increase, the average sea level rise, and averages hide the peaks and the extremes, and it is the peaks and the extremes that really hurt us. So that would I think really add to the engagement of that table. And attachment 3 in that table, I note obviously we're still at the end of phase 1, but I really do look forward to the day when the gaps piece is fully filled in, but I understand that's the piece of stage 2 to do. So we have spent a fair bit of time on this item, but very enthusiastically, and really appreciate the work from everyone involved. In that case, I might just ask Councillor McPherson what he would like to add, and then we'll pass the motion, hopefully.
Well, Madam Chair, I wanted to move it, but I think the resolution, the second part of the recommendation, could do with a little bit of work. And,
Okay,
and I
what
was
do you
wondering if I could
propose?
suggest something,
Yeah.
please.
Just find it. We could bring that up on the screen, that'd be great.
Just says that the summary report, phase 1 of the Waikato Regional Council Climate Change Risk Assessment and Planning for phase 2 attached as Appendix 1 is approved for release to stakeholders. I think we need to show the respect to Fred's opening comments, actually. And I don't know how the words, but as a start for 10, I would suggest, acknowledging a medium-term view to rank risks, because I'm hearing around this room that we want to rank the risks. In other words, we are going to show the electorate that we care so much about this subject that we're going to not just throw all the risks out there.
Mhm.
We're going to say, there's all the risks, but by the way, here's the ranking.
And
And
so
if- and
an
if we set-
initial ranking to get feedback on from them as well?
Yeah.
Would that be
Yes.
what you're talking
I mean,
about?
my original words were going to be to work with stakeholders to rank risks. But I think we need to send a really clear message to the executive that, and to James, it's not good enough to scattergun all the risks at the people. We need to do the thinking for them and rank them. So
I understand what you're saying,
Yeah.
and it doesn't strike me as wrong in any way. I was just wondering, Karen or Lisa, do you have a suggestion on wording or some feedback before we talk about that?
Well, I think what Councillor McPherson said is entirely consistent with what the proposed approach is. So we'll be pulling together focus groups of subject matter experts from around the region to actually rank those risks.
Yes, sorry.
So you would like that reflected in the...
I would, Lisa, because it says to the comms team when we go to tell a story that this is part of the longer term story. So it helps to Chair Barry's point, it helps drive some of the nervousness out of the conversation, I would have thought.
Yeah, the wording for the resolution doesn't come to me quickly either. But Karen, did you have some thoughts? To turn your mic on, that's all.
So recommendation 2, that the summary report phase 1 of the Waikato Regional Climate Change Risk Assessment and Planning for phase 2 attached as Appendix 1 be approved for release to stakeholders with a covering document clarifying the intent to prioritise in collaboration with them.
That sounds great.
That's the intent. Or with a view to using this to work.
Yeah.
What do you think, Fred? Yeah, you pretty much nailed it. We do need to have that in there.
All right, so you haven't got your mic on, but we can start writing that out and then we can pass the motion. With the cover document outlining or emphasising the proposed approach to rank.
To work collaboratively with stakeholders and partners.
But there was a ranking piece there.
To
Oh, yeah.
to understand and prioritise
To
and rank.
understand and prioritise. Prioritise.
Madam Chair, could I please suggest that we use the word rate, which is a bit more consistent with
Rate.
risk assessment terminology? Oh, rank
Understand
replaces
and-
rank, yeah. You just say rate the risks. I mean, inherent in that is that you're prioritising them.
Okay. So with the covering document emphasising the proposed approach to understand and prioritise rate.
No.
No.
To understand, rate.
And rate. Understand and rate. Rate risks. Great. We'll just take out the prioritise and then and the and. Great. All those in favour, please say aye.
I need a second.
Oh, a seconder? Fred Litchrock. Yeah. Thank you for the reminder. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Now, apologies to everyone who is sitting patiently waiting for their turn to speak. We are about 25 minutes over time, but we will make that work, and it was a fantastic report. Thank you very much. And thank you, James, for online as well. Really feel like we've got this one in good hands. So in that case, I'm going to invite up Blair Dickey to present on the National Adaptation Plan and the implications for us in regards to that, now that we have this national direction. Welcome, Blair.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you, Madam Chair. I have an easy job today. I'm reporting on someone else's work.
Yep.
So I drew the long straw. And just, if I may, just a comment to, in response to Councillor McPherson's points before in the previous item, I think it's the other Blair that you're looking for resource economic
For economics, yes.
input.
Blair Keenan, yes.
And yeah, Blair Keenan. And also my impression from this work that the government is really looking for feedback on this, on its work through the Climate Commission's reviews and that sort of thing. So the council itself would have the ear of government on this. In the interests of brevity, if we could have the slideshow up, thanks, William.
We will take it as read, but we'll just flick through your slides very quickly. So if there's an image in there that we like, then we can refer to it.
And I'll provide this brief presentation on the National Adaptation Plan, and for consistency, we'll use the government's slides. Which one are you looking at now? That slide there is...
It's a big overview, isn't it, of the actual document?
That's the structure of the plan. The implications to your work occur in all of the parts of the plan. Just some background on it. This was released earlier in August, the 3rd of August, 2 years to the day after the National Risk Assessment, Climate Change Risk Assessment. It is the product of 294 submissions, and MFE staff described those as having impressive content, and it is changed from the draft. The submissions were able to influence the plan, and with key themes, to highlight the need for urgency, to recognise the role of local government, to prioritise nature-based solutions, to make climate change data available to all, and to stop building in dangerous places. Those are the key themes of the submissions they were saying. So what you have here is their response to that, and it does change from the draft. My apologies, and also to recognise the Roe Order framework to enable equitable transition for Māori, led by Māori. The slide relating to the structure.
Do you want to go back one or forward one? Sorry.
Includes the long-term adaptation goals, the role of the climate change risk assessments. Doesn't quite follow the domain approach of the National Risk Assessment, but that is the nature of this. It is an evolving piece of work, and it will evolve over time. The slide that had the sectors and roles of sectors.
Yep, the first one that we kind of...
Do you want me to just go to the end?
No, we don't.
No,
Oh.
go back. We'll go back to slide 4.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. I just thought that one.
That one, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. These are the key sectors that have been identified as being needing to be involved. Effectively, everything we do is going to have to occur in a climate-altered future, and they have particular identified the roles of central government, local government, Māori, the private sector, research community, and communities and individuals. Planning will be ongoing and evolutionary, and in that context, what you see here is just the standard policy development, evaluation and review cycle, whereas those northern and eastern circles have been prepared by central government, and that's where we are at the moment with the National Adaptation Plan. But the southern and western circle will be the role of the Climate Change Commission, and the Climate Change Commission will take this on from that time on. Next slide, please, William. Thank you. Right, and these are the system. This is just an example of the system-wide responses, and the first one of those recognises that access to information or relevant information is going to be required. And so we already have, as an organisation, access to the AR6 regional projections. Big tip to the firm, and thanks to Mike Scarsbrook and his team and his budget for that. NIWA will provide these for the rest of the country in 2024, later part of that. So we're ahead of the game in that respect. Climate Adaptation Portal is being developed. You might have heard of the EQC portal that is already available. This climate risk and resilience portal will be different from that, but it will be complementary. So there will be two information portals in the natural hazards and climate response area. Target guidance will be available on how to have regard to the NAP, the adaptation plan, and RMA policies and plans. And that's expected to be out before the 30th of November, but I won't say anything more about that because it's the next item. The government wants better use of LIMS to convey information. Now, at the moment, most territorial authorities currently have deflected the natural hazards elements by noting on LIMS that parties should contact the relevant regional council. I think they'll be scrambling for information on this, so that may be a bit of work that we're up for in the short term. Next slide, please, William. Thanks. And this is also one of the system-wide implications, and it recognises that climate adaptation is local. It's all about water, either too much of it or not enough of it. And the reform links directly to the proposed Spatial Planning Act and the requirement to prepare regional spatial strategies. There is no requirement for regional adaptation plans. This is the role of the regional spatial strategy. So when you think about what the government's RM system reforms are about, this is the climate response there. The national planning framework will rely, it mentions that, will rely on the NBA, and the regional spatial strategies will rely on the the Spatial Planning Act. And we'll get both of those bills out in October. So that's something that we're going to have an opportunity to feedback quite soon on. Currently, with respect to services and water services particularly, the local government sector is split. Territorial authorities have the service delivery role of Three Waters, and that's soon to be transitioning to the 4 water entities, but the regional council role remains the same. We are the regulator, and we will be in the future, and you can't allocate what you don't have. And so that is the climate implication of the Three Waters reform. It's really critical there. And that may mean that we need to take another look at regional growth strategies already. Thank you. And this is the last of the system-wide reforms, recognising that in some cases we may not be able to protect and accommodate, but will need to retreat from increasingly risky or dangerous places. The CAA, the Climate Adaptation Act, is the third part of the RM system reforms, and that, I'm advised, is going to be limited to financial mechanisms to finance retreat and undoing legal constraints to retreat. And there will be te tiriti implications there. That's expected out Q3 of 2023, but that's really close to the general election. So expect a bit of flexibility there. The government may decide to go with it, they may not, and probably know by May next year whether that will happen. The future for local government reforms is critical here, and it's identified as one of the items, recognising that one of the points of action on that is funding for local government, and obviously that funding is what's a constraint to people retreating at the moment. They're picking up on submissions and responding to the recall for nature-based solutions. Currently we have really high performance catchments, both urban with impervious activities, covering, and also landscape scale with changes to ground cover that respond really quickly to rainfall events, and described by NIWA's climate scientist Chris Brandolino as long dry periods with binge rainfall. So that's our future. And so what we're going to need to do is look at those, how do we recreate those groundwater recharge zones, wetlands, and reforest some areas. Again, it doesn't take much of a look-see to look at the role of the regional spatial strategies there, which is our role as a sector, wider sector. Also, planting of shade trees and things like that and water sensitive urban design, that's been allocated to HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Next slide, please. What I don't propose to do is go through each of those specific outcome areas, but just to give you a bit of a flavour. First one is the natural environment. That's 100% local government partnership with central government. It's all about freshwater allocations, biodiversity strategies, biosecurity responses, and water security and storage. That's us. Number two, the homes and building and places, and that's again the location and the design of developments, growth strategies, and that's working with TAs. Infrastructure, the third one, that's, where is it going to be appropriate to invest for infrastructure to support new developments? And that's the role of the regional spatial strategy. Communities, this is a reactive one. Most of the elements here are forward-looking. How do we change things? This is making sure that we're better prepared to respond to the inevitable, but there is a new health adaptation plan, which is new. Final one, the economy and financial systems. Focus there is on making sure that the economy stays afloat, doesn't tank, and is looking at supply chains and the implementation of the TCFD or climate-related risk disclosures. And we can expect insurance and banking industry to become more engaged in that space. Final element, the implementation. The adaptation element is going to be delivered by 30 agencies, going back to the mantra that everything is going to be affected by a changing climate. We've left the climate that all our cities, systems, culture, agriculture has developed in. We need research, we need understanding and information to fill knowledge gaps. There will be 2 yearly reviews of the implementation of this. And the key thing here is that it is the role of the Climate Change Commission, and it will assess the effectiveness at reducing risk. Not just have the actions been done, but have they been successful in reducing risk? So it's more that, are we doing the right things rather than have we done the things we said we would? Last slide. This is it. This just gives you a timeline, and it summarises the actions needed to support things. And there are a number of very key items here, particularly 2004, where they specifically identify local government's long-term plans. That's a big hint that we're going to be funding some of this work. There's also in 2025 the launch of the National Planning Framework, where the adaptation and, as an aside, the emissions reduction elements of the national guidance and direction will be embodied into the National Planning Framework. We'll have to give effect to it from that stage on, and in the first tranche in the development of the regional spatial strategies. And 2027, before the end of the, or the development of the next iteration of the National Adaptation Plan, there's another opportunity for local government, long-term planning and funding. We're going to be required to have regard to this and the ERP when preparing policies and plans. I don't want to say too much about that. I don't want to steal Alejandro's thunder, because for the next item.
That's right.
The ERP, we haven't heard anything about that today. It's all about the adaptation plan, but I thought it might be interesting just to look at the differences. That's about changing our economic and social systems. The National Adaptation Plan is an imperative for the need to change what we're doing now, and how can communities be supported by central government and by inference government partners, ourselves as well. So it's a bit of a slight difference in the directions there, and they're written differently to recognise that. And if
I was just going to say, I appreciate your interpretations of these documents, Blair, because you can read them yourself, but with all of your background and knowledge, it's just nice to have that put into context.
Oh, thank you for those words. And finally, if I just might be able to say, it's been an absolute pleasure to report to this committee over the last term, and I've just noticed the change in the dimension and the complexity of the work that you've been addressing. I mean, right back earlier on, we were talking
Dabbling.
about including climate into decision making. Now it's just recognising just how that's happening. The questions have been searching, thought-provoking, really challenged me sometimes, and engagement's been enjoyable, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Blair. No, you have been so helpful to this committee, and I cannot thank you enough for all the work you did before we even got here. So I'm going to actually make it really easy on you, and I'm going to ask all of the councillors who, if they did have a question on the National Adaptation Plan that they can read, that they catch up with you at another time so we can save some time. But and then we can pass over to Alejandro. Oh, did you have an observation? I didn't see any lights on. Have a quick observation. Where's the light on? Dennis.
Oh, I got it.
I didn't
first,
see.
quick off the draw.
Sorry, it just looked all blank. I thought we'd, but yeah, a quick one from
Look,
both
just
of you.
a quick question, I think, and you touched on it there. One of the big disappointments, I think, out of this plan is, you know, and I think people were expecting more about the managed retreat issue, and it's not there.
Yeah, the funding
and,
of that.
And so I just wonder whether we could, I mean, we're in the mood of adding bits to resolutions. We could add a request that the council ask the government to prioritise the passing of that legislation. Because it seems to me the big gap in it, you know, you touched on it, maybe become an election issue. Well, politics shouldn't be entering into this. We need this. And you know, it's evident in Westport already, it's evident actually in Thames, where they're already talking about managed retreat as an option. And unless we have the framework there and the funding to go with it, you know, all this sort of work that's been done on shoreline management or whatever is going to stall because people are just waiting for this law to be passed. So I've got some wording here I can suggest to add on to the recommendation. And the committee recommends to council that it asks the government to prioritise the passing of the legislation to support managed retreat of assets from at-risk areas, and that just takes the wording out of the document.
Yeah, no, it's a good resolution. I understand our policy team, you know, who are making submissions. I don't recall, but if we've made that one before, it might well be consistent with what we already are doing. But I think it sends a good message to have that in resolution form. So I'd be happy to second it. Or if you wanted to, Andrew. No. Okay, then I'll second it. Blair, did you want to comment as well? I'll just get Andrew or one of you to turn it off. Thank you. Go, Blair.
Yeah, I was just wanting to get a feel for what would be the modality. How do we do that? Letter from the chairman to government or something like that? Or? Yeah, because this is not available for submission or anything else. We've got it now. We make it happen.
The submission process.
Yeah, cool. Good to have clarified that. Andrew, did you have a comment while we're typing that up?
My observation would be, in my experience of life, we normally socialise bad news and privatise good news. And as a result of that, you see wealth transfer. For the first time, we're going to be socialising some good news and privatising the bad news, which goes back to my banging on about stranded assets. And it's interesting that Treasury up there, 18 months after the big financial institutions make their disclosure of risks, are going to, what does the language say? Treasury will integrate climate risks into their decision making. So clearly, the people who've got capital at risk are going to be, their banks are going to do a good job of saying, well, for example, the peat farmers or the farmers on the coast have got some real risks here. 18 months later, Treasury is going to come along and say, now we're going to build climate risks into the way we do our work. I just think those are interesting observations. It's not a question, it's just an observation.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so we've got the resolution ready. The committee recommends to council that it asks the government to prioritise the passing of legislation to appoint managed retreat of assets from at-risk areas. Recommends to council that the chair
to accelerate legislation.
Oh, yeah. We will put that in.
Recommends the chair that
Request the chair. We've got the chair here. Just the chair is not shaking his head or anything, so we look to be on good ground here. And then there was a piece around to accelerate rather than prioritise. That's all right.
Because
That's the mover in.
It has been prioritised.
Yeah. Yeah, well, here we are requesting. Probably could have been all right just asking you, but here we are. No, very good. We've got mover and Councillor Tegg. We've got seconder and myself. All the,
This needs to be a B resolution.
that's fine, yeah. That's fine.
Where's that bad grammar?
I think, can we fix the grammar later?
Did I do that?
We'll tidy that up. Sorry.
Request the chair.
The chair
Okay.
that he asks.
Yeah.
No, we are not in it, Barry.
Sorry, the rights.
That he writes to the government to request. All right, while it's getting typed up, I imagine you guys are okay with that. Mover by Dennis, seconded by myself. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thanks very much, everyone, and thank you very much, Blair. We are now going to have Alejandro and Amy and Bruce to present to us the implications for plan making in regards to the RMA. If we just turn your mic on, we're all good to go. Thank you.
Just checking that people and I can hear me properly as well. I'll assume that's a
We'll have
yes.
to assume so far because there's been no
Yes,
comments to say otherwise. Yeah, go ahead.
Tēnā koutou te komiti, hei te mahi ahu te kanihera arohi o Waikato. He kaituki ko papahere whakahaere ko Alejandro Cifuentes te kuingwa. Nā reira, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koe, committee, thank you for allowing me to speak to you again. I'm here today to talk to you about the RMA amendment of 2020. I have asked Amy Robinson to my right, the manager of regional consents, and Bruce McCauley, the manager of resource management policy, to be with me to take your questions. So I have a small presentation just to take you through some of the contents of the paper, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, if you
Madam
just
Chair.
go through it quickly, that'd be nice. Thank you.
So in essence, what you'll notice is that the paper talks about the implications for plan making and resource allocation functions, and it doesn't list all the actions that we are doing as a council that involve having regard to mitigation and adaptation in terms of climate change. You've heard some of that work already by what Lisa is doing with the consultants, and also it ties into a lot of the work that we do with working on adaptation planning with district councils. So as you can see in the slide, what we have is the repeal of sections 78, 104E, 104F. And the main thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is half regard to. So now is the repeal of section 70A, essentially, and 140 and 104F have removed the negative obligation that we have not to have regard to. And the Zero Carbon Act and then the amendment of the RMA in 2020 have introduced a new positive obligation to have regard to the emissions reduction plan and the national adaptation plan. So in the past, we didn't or we couldn't have regard to the effects of climate change as a contaminant in discharges to air. So that was those sections that you see at the top. And the relevant sections 61 and 66, that's for regional council to prepare the regional policy statement and the regional plans. Next slide, please. It's very small, but don't worry. This is in your agenda pack,
Yes.
page 47, paragraphs 17 to 18. In a nutshell, is the direction that the courts have given, and it's pretty old jurisprudence here, as to what it means to have regard to. And it's kind of held since then, but it means a careful consideration, something that the decision maker cannot just do away with at the beginning of their assessment of whatever they're about to do under the RMA. And if we go to the next slide.
If I may to quickly ask, it basically means, like you were told at school, show you're working, right, to get to the answer. It's like that you had regard to, you will have at some point in your work looked at it and considered it And you might have recorded that then, being in the place that we are.
Correct.
Cool,
That's
thank you.
correct, Madam Chair. In the bottom, that slide is essentially, it's a line in paragraph 18, but it means this having regard to is also framed in the context of the primacy of part 2 of the RMA. So it means that we will have consideration, we will take what we considered necessary for our decision making, exclude some of the other things, but part 2 has primacy over the have regard to, just in terms of the legal direction that we have. And if we, I think, no, that's last slide. Sorry, I did another presentation of this, I had other more slides in my head.
No worries.
But in essence, as I pointed out, so as you can see in your agenda pack, we have listed a number of impacts that it will have on our, so that's paragraphs 22 to 28 relates to our plan-making functions. As you can see, many of these things that have impact is on work programs that are already ongoing. So the amendments of 2020, if you look at them, grounded the amendment of 2004 to have particular regard to the effects of climate change as other matters. So that's section 7 of the RMA. And now what we're doing is having the more specific frame of what it is that are those effects of climate change. So one is the mitigation side of the emissions reduction plan and the adaptation side of the national adaptation plan. And then for the implications that regard to consenting functions, that's paragraphs 29 to 36 of your agenda pack. And with that, to set the context, we can take questions now.
Okay, I might just quickly give a little bit of background that, sorry, there's just a big motorbike outside. That as recently, when some of the councillors here became aware of the change that Greater Wellington Regional Council is currently consulting on in regards to it, altering the regional policy statement to include climate emission mitigation information and a climate chapter of its own. A few of us got quite excited and hence we've had conversations with our exec team about that being something to aim towards for our council as well. And so my understanding is that we are looking at scoping up a piece of work like that. So because we are currently in the process of reviewing our RPS to give effect to the freshwater regulation changes, we can look at whether these changes can be implemented in that kind of timeframe as well. Councillor Tegg, did you want to add anything to that? Because it's been a particular interest of yours as well. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I didn't see your mic, Stu.
Yeah, look, it's a really exciting development, I think, this change that I think you said starts on the 30th of November. And I think what's pleasing, I think, is that in a way, Greater Wellington Council have anticipated this reform and have done the groundwork where they're at a point they're now about to notify a plan which has, you know, quite substantial objectives and policies and rules that anticipate that this change on the 30th of November. And they've also gone further than that in terms of actually introducing objectives which have firm targets, especially relating to transport emissions. So they have an overall target, I think, of contributing to a 50% reduction by 2030, built into an objective in the plan, and the ultimate aim to have zero carbon by 2050. But then they've actually drilled down further and had specific targets relating to mode shift and getting people out of cars and so on. And also some quite groundbreaking, I think, objectives and policies relating to urban form in terms of new subdivisions, so they're not, they're not embedding in transport emissions when you have a new subdivision, for example. So I think that's all showing us the way forward, and I suppose where I'd like to get a bit more clarity from Karen is just where we're at in terms of that scoping, where we're at with our own sort of review of this. and how
Okay,
that fits into our own work program and resourcing, so on long-term plan issues and all that stuff.
sure. Karen or Alejandro, who would like to?
So please, Karen.
Then I'll give you this. Oh,
Thank you. Yes, thanks very much, Chair. So yes, thank you. And we had a discussion with the Director of Science, Policy and Information, and she has confirmed that she has engaged a consultant to start the initial scoping of a project plan relating to the regional policy statement, to just put the policy project into a place to take account of the Council's increased obligations since the RPS came in May 2016 and regarding our climate change response. And that scoping will indicate how might we go about building up those targets that contribute to the national directions. Also, in addition to that, with having regard to the work that's been done to date on the coastal policy statement, the coastal policy plan, the fresh water.
Yeah.
These are also bringing in climate considerations. Bruce, you wanted to say something there?
Yeah, councillors, you'll see in the draft coastal plan there's some specific policies and objectives around climate change, and it's a matter that we're looking at very closely for the freshwater policy review. We have to give effect to the climate change policy in the MPS freshwater that we have to give effect to, and we're looking at those right now. And as you've heard, we've just had the first round of feedback on the freshwater policy, and climate change was raised as an issue during that process.
Awesome. And then, oh, sorry.
Just one more thing to add to. Yep. We have invited the Director of Transport to speak at the end of the session today,
Yeah, sure.
because he also has some direct inputs into this work program as well.
Yeah, sure.
And then it's just a matter of the new council, please, from that scoping plan, getting the advice as to whether more resourcing will be required and at what timeframes, we can achieve those things. Yeah.
Just the other comment I'd make is to acknowledge the work that Blair Dickey has done in getting stuff into the existing plan.
At an early stage.
So, that was when we didn't actually have the authority to do anything about emission reduction. But we've made a good start there. And then our own climate roadmap has also laid out the pathway, I think, as to how we incorporate that into actual policy. But given that was really, is limited to being a discussion document, it's not actual policy, and that's been pointed out to us by other councillors on occasion. So now I think what's exciting, we have the opportunity to actually make it policy with objectives and policies and rules that actually do, move the dial on emission reductions.
Totally agree.
But just the other
Yes.
point is, I suppose this raises the question for the incoming council around resourcing. So in terms of funding, what new resourcing do we need to undertake this work? And I assume that will be part of the scoping project.
Awesome, thank you. I'll pass on to Stu Nebo. Thank you for waiting.
All right, I don't really want to ask this question, but I feel like I should. Do you guys have any sense as to whether, when we issue consents for livestock grazing operations, effectively agriculture, which is a pretty significant part of the region, whether at some point it'll be expected that we take into consideration the methane emissions from livestock, or is that too hard a question to answer?
Yeah. Happy to take that question, Madam Chair. Two things. If we go to the next slide, I kind of put some of the things that relate to that. So it's a paying for new discharge? So the answer is yes. Come 30th of November, there will be the ability for council to have regard to greenhouse gas emissions as a contaminant to air. Now, given that the government is working with Te Waikato, that is, say, for the moment, it's been put aside because there's a specific work stream from the government that is working to bring farming emissions of methane into the fold with what is to be controlled. So the assumption that the sector is working under is that that will be also the way we will approach it. So we will approach other greenhouse gas emissions, and once that bit is solved at the national level, then we will actually have more clarity. The expectation that we have from the government is that we will get guidance, national policy statements, and national environmental standards to actually control some of this in the absence of rules and plans. And if I make an observation related to the regional Wellington region example, they have taken a lot of the work programs that are already existing to address issues related to climate change. So that's a freshwater package, indigenous biodiversity, and then what they anticipate will be some of the changes in the outcome system. So that is actually commendable. But as always, there is the early adopter risk of maybe not having the complete framework of how the RMA is going to look like, and then having to do more changes along the way. And those might be offset by the ability to shape it in their own way as well. And that includes transferring or via the regional policy statement, giving district councils the ability to control or the obligation to control some of these emissions that come from land use specifically. In some instances from the activities as a contaminant, then that will be regional council. And yes, so in a nutshell, going back, answer yes from 30th of November. Our government is working with Waikato on that very, very particular sector, the primary sector and the farming emissions.
Fortunately, the 30th of November and the December sometime are quite close together, but I am really feeling for, Amy, your staff, etc., around not having that guidance yet from MFE. It's very unfortunate to be in that phase of anticipation, considering it's already been kicked down the road with delays already. So,
and if I can just add, we did hear from MFE a week ago saying, yes, we think we will make it on that date, but we really don't have any confidence. So tomorrow, all of the regional consents managers are getting together to try and come up with a bit of a plan B, from the 30th of November, how are we going to work and trying to be nationally consistent in the absence of an NES, which is where we think we're going to be on that date. So
I really appreciate that. Thank you. That is a good initiative based on what we've seen in the space so far. Angela.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. My question follows on from what Dennis mentioned about the resourcing. As it's, just wondering what the timing and the process and whether there's capacity in-house for what's coming or where we might be looking to meet that resourcing for technical capacity.
So from my perspective, we are expecting that we will be contracting that expertise in. I'm not across what kind of expertise we have in the science team in that particular area, but I am aware that there is a national air quality group. I think they're getting together in the next couple of weeks, which is regional council representatives and MFE again, to try and come up with a bit of a plan about how we deal with this. And so at the moment in consenting, we have known technical experts that we would use for air discharges, for example, at landfills, but we're not really across the wider group of people. And I think the other issue that we're going to come across is that nationally, there's probably only a few of these people and everyone is going to be wanting access to them. So I think it might be a bit of a struggle. And in terms of our consenting team, we only have one person who's really good at air quality discharges. So that might be a gap for us as well.
Okay, just are we getting more through the chain? Like, is this sort of an area where universities are upskilling people, or does anyone sort of know?
Here you go.
It is recognised across New Zealand, these issues, and the regional sector group has got a climate change working group established, which will be looking at these issues across. And we do have our own, Waikato University has just established a degree course in climate change. So we're hoping to see more students coming through. And we are looking forward to introducing you to Alice Wheatley-Wilson, who's just popped out for a minute, but will be back for the next item, who is one of our students that has come through and is developing the expertise for our organisation in GHG emissions, for example.
Fantastic. And just finally, just a general question, seeing that climate making decisions are going to undergird everything that we're doing. Just looking forward to the annual plan and the long-term plan. Are we going to see an increase in capacity that we need to address this across the organisation?
Yes, that's the work we are doing right now. And that's about applying the climate action roadmap pathways to the National Adaptation Plan and the emissions reduction plan actions, and identifying, as we said, the gaps, also the staff and the resourcing required to be able to deliver on those actions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Then Councillor Litchfield.
Yeah, resourcing's dealt with. I want to go back to the coastal plan because I think it's particularly weak when it comes to what could be done to complement climate change and complement carbon uptake. Example, seagrass beds. They've only identified a remnant of what's there without any adequate protections of what could be there as far as biodiversity areas that have been mapped are only based on remnant bits of science without taking into account estuaries as in its quantum as being an area that seagrass should be abundant in all harbours and estuaries, yet the coastal plan doesn't allow for that. It doesn't give the ultimate protections to actually allow for continued uptake of carbon. So I think that should be relooked or at least strengthened as far as this is concerned. Thank you.
I can interpret that, Bruce, to answer, but it's really that because the coastal plan will be falling post 30th of November as well, there are certain things then how that will apply.
Yeah, and we do have the workshop this afternoon.
Oh, we do, of course.
Where there's an opportunity to perhaps discuss that very issue.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Andrew.
Alejandro, my question is of you. You used the word primacy and you said that Section 2 will take primacy. And in terms of the RMA, I've interpreted that primacy to mean pretty similar to how we respond to Te Ture, Whaimana, or Te Awa, or Waikato. When you use that word primacy of Section 2, is that where you were going, or is there some other interpretation of primacy that you want to talk to us about?
Through you, Madam Chair. So that is in the event of when you're weighing in the different things that you have to have regard to, one of those things is in conflict with Part 2 of the RMA, then that's what the primacy comes in. So it's just that Part 2 of the RMA trumps many other things, and there's a specific direction that comes from the Act. And in this case, from court precedent that tells that when something conflicts with Part 2 of the RMA, that's when, and that includes many of the things you named.
Thank you. So can you give us an example of what in the future with 70A gone and 260's gone, what that might look like? What's new about that? And give us an example of how you think that would work.
Right, you put me in a tight bind to have to remember exactly Part 2 of the RMA. But in essence, it will be. There's some specific considerations.
Let me help you. Part two talks about purpose, matters of national importance, other matters in Treaty of Waitangi.
Well, then in that case, I was Blair coming to my aid.
No,
There you go. Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
That's the one. Perfect. There we go. So that's, in essence, if any of the things that we're considering, so it's not just limited to the emissions reduction plan, the national adaptation plan, but if any of those things conflict for the case of section 6, as you named, for example, the management of significant risk from natural hazards, then we will be obliged to actually prioritize the management of natural hazard risk. If that's, yeah. Anyway.
How about your question, Andrew? Very good. Okay, thank you. My only feedback on this would be as well, you made mention in the later part of the report around considering, there is the opportunity to review consents as well after we know what we're doing. So yeah, just putting that out there that I'd find that really interesting if you were able to identify kind of the types of consents in due course, obviously, like mid next year kind of thing.
Only some consents will be subject to
That's
review.
right.
It has to be in the conditions already. So for some we will be able to and some we might not.
Yeah, awesome. It'd just be interesting out of the ones where it already is, whether there are any that are even large emitters, for example. Yeah, awesome. I don't have anyone else. In that case, keen to receive the report. Barry, you happy to move? Yeah. It's just to receive the report. Angela, second. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much to all three of you and all of the policy and consenting work that you do for our organisation. Is there a request for a break? Yes, we all need to go to the toilet, and there are plenty of them. So, no, I actually do. Been drinking water the whole time. So let's have a short break. We'll be back when the long hand is on the 8, so 20 to 12, please. Thank you. Yep, 5 minutes is enough. Yeah. Just stretch your legs.